All right, so what is the Carbon Leadership Forum? I know there's a lot of new people on, so I just want to briefly cover this. The Carbon Leadership Forum aims to accelerate the transformation of the building sector to radically reduce the embodied carbon in building materials and construction through collective action. So there's lots of resources available with the CLF, but in the last year, CLF has started these regional hubs, and that's what this meeting is. It's the Rocky Mountain Regional Hub for CLF. And the whole idea of creating these hubs is to create a community to collaborate among people in the architecture world, construction, upstream and materials and products, and other interested stakeholders, and get us talking with each other to see what we can do at the local level or regional level to take action and help each other learn and reduce impacts. So that's why we're here. There are currently 25 hubs that are active, so that we've seen some growth over the last year. You can see that we're divided up into 3 global regions. So there's several in the Western North America, Asian, Australia region. We are in the Central North America, Central and South America region. And then there's also several in the Eastern North America, Europe, and Africa region. So keep that in mind if you know anyone in those areas that are interested in joining. And then also you can find a lot more information at the carbonleadershipforum.org website. There's lots of webinars, reports, resources, focus group materials. I'm not going to go through all of these focus groups, but there's a lot of different sources out there to help you both learn and see what you can do to help the cause. All right, I'm going to go through a quick demo on the website. I'm going to start out and show you how to create an account on CLF and then join our Rocky Mountain community, because this is how we often communicate with each other. So let me switch over. All right, so carbonleadershipforum.org/regional hubs. This is where you can find out information about the regional hub. If you click the second link on that slide, it takes you to this sign up page where you can actually enter your information and sign up for a free account at the Carbon Leadership Forum. On the third link on that slide, which you'll receive, if you go to the community.carbonleadershipforum.org website, you can hover over groups and then regional hubs, and it'll show you a list of the regional hubs, and you can just click on Rocky Mountain, and then you will see a join button up here. I'm already joined, so it doesn't say that for me. And then you'll be able to see everyone in the group and be able to post messages and follow conversations, and it's a great way to interact with each other. For those that don't want to join the online community, you can also sign up for our email list. There's lots of people on our email list, so I've included a link for that as well. All you have to do is enter your email address and your name and subscribe, and that's how we send out group emails to each other. So you'll receive a copy of these slides, so should be pretty straightforward. All right, I'm going to switch it over to Matt real quick, and he is going to talk about this new initiative we have going. So you want to jump in?
So one thing that we've spoken to a lot of folks about is, whether there's a centralized list of practitioners in the region who offer things like, performing LCAs or offering low embodied carbon building design services, things along those lines. So we thought that the best way to start something like this would be to crowdsource it with you all. I think this is a great way to help build our network, help government and non-government entities to improve their procurement of low embodied carbon projects, and for our network to grow in general. So if you go to the link here, tinyurl.com/rmclf, there's an open Google Doc there. You'll see I've already added a couple of companies. I added a few represented by folks on this call. I volunteered a few people's names as potential points of contact, but I didn't put any. I'd like you all to add companies that you've heard of, add yourselves, And if I've put your name here, Bob from KLNA and Lisa with Colorado Earth, I put their names here, but no emails unless I have your permission. But the intent is that this will be a publicly available document. We're not specifically endorsing these companies, and we're not planning to edit this unless we see every company under the sun. Because there's a column here for organizational commitments related to embodied carbon, but we also don't just want every general contractor in Denver here. We want folks who have worked on these types of projects. So, please add names, please reach out to others who you think should be on this, and let me know if you have any questions. But the URL is there, and I'll drop it in the chat too, just to make it easier on you all.
Great.
And Matt, sorry, just to add that you will be sending an email with a reminder and the link to everybody on this call today, and kind of like explaining where does it come from, why are we asking for this information. So look up for an email from Matt with that information.
Yeah, I think that'll be in the follow-up to this meeting.
All right, great. Thanks, Matt. All right, well, without further ado, we're going to move on to our keynote presentation for this meeting, which is how Denver is addressing embodied carbon. So we have two speakers with us from the city today. We have Katrina Manigan, who leads the high performance buildings and homes team for the Denver Office of Climate Action, Sustainability and Resilience. The team is working to make all new and all existing buildings and homes in Denver net zero energy, more sustainable and more resilient. Katrina has over 15 years of experience working on energy policy, climate policy, and net zero energy buildings. Amber Wood leads the energy program for the City and County of Denver in the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability and Resiliency. She seeks to ensure Denver achieves its climate goals for buildings through her work as part of the high performance buildings and homes team. Amber's background in engineering includes experience in net zero energy buildings, sustainability codes and standards, construction, and research and development. So welcome, Katrina and Amber. Can you please tell me who I should make the host so that you can share your screen?
I'll share first, and then Amber has a presentation in the second half.
All right, great. Here you go. So take it away when you are ready.
Great. Thank you so much for having us today. It's great to be with all of you. I know a few of the names, so hello to those that we've worked with before. I see some of our favorite stakeholders who have given us great input on our work before here in this meeting, and it's nice to meet all of you who we haven't had a chance to meet before. As Jim said, I lead the Buildings and Homes team here in Denver's Office of Climate Action, Sustainability and Resiliency, and we have just recently completed an embodied carbon inventory just for buildings. So I'm here to share those results with you. Really looking forward to getting your feedback and thoughts on the inventory that we share, because this is our first one. And it is something where we could still adjust or tweak a few things, or maybe we should show a chart a bit of a different way. So if we're not giving the kind of data that will enable our community to make good decisions about embodied carbon, let me know, because this is new for us. And so I'll go through that embodied carbon inventory, and then Amber will tell you about the 2021 code update process, because we're adopting code this year. And so there's a chance through that code adoption process to address some of embodied carbon if we wanted to, and you all could get involved in that. So we'll put in a plug for sort of how to make some of this real here in Denver. So with that, I'll jump in and share my screen. Okay, go full screen. All over there. Okay, it didn't start at the beginning. All right, let's see, I clicked on the first one. We don't want to start in the middle. Okay. The is good. I can actually see a few of you. I can't see the chat currently, so feel free just to chime in if you have questions. I'd like to make this really interactive. I can see just a handful of your faces. And so if the moderators or Amber want to flag, if somebody puts something in the chat, feel free to interrupt me. So little overview, and this is probably pretty basic for a lot of you if you're part of the Carbon Leadership Forum thinking about embodied carbon. But this is where we started in our first sort of look at embodied carbon in buildings as the life cycle stages of a typical building. And what are we talking about when we're talking about embodied carbon? So we're talking about the product stage, the construction stage, some of the use stage, right? Where you've got repairs and refurbishments and replacements, and then also at end of life, that carbon. And then there's operational carbon, which is of course part of whole life carbon, that's usually what we've looked at. So just as like a, what has our team been the most focused on? It's been operational energy use. So I'll actually just start there because this is really familiar content for me. Buildings and homes account for 64% of Denver's operational emissions. And so transportation is the next chunk. And then there's a few other things that make up little pieces. But when buildings and homes are a lot of this is also called production emissions, right? This is all the emissions from the electricity and the natural gas used in buildings. And so then when we go, this actually should be 49% for the buildings and 15% for the homes. I just had this off by one. For our 2019 inventory. And then new buildings are really important because in 2050, 40% of our building stock will be new. And that's where, of course, it's really relevant to talk about embodied carbon. It's where we can do something about embodied carbon. And we have a goal for all these new buildings to be net zero energy. But again, we're talking about net zero operations when we set that goal by 2030. Amber recently wrote a whole plan on how we're going to take buildings to net zero energy by 2030, but it's all operational energy. So with that, I just thought I would show, this is another just helpful framing graphic for how we're thinking about this issue of embodied carbon. Shows, sort of on the top line is where we are now. I mean, we might be slightly better because our commercial code, for example, is 15% better than the national 2018 IECC, but you can see the carbon, there's a bunch from raw material extraction, a bunch from manufacturing, a bunch from construction, and then there's all the operations of the building, and then the end of life and demolition. And as we go towards our net zero energy goal, you can see in green, that operations part drops down, right? And so, and then this graphic included net positive. It's not a goal of ours at this time, but if we could get to net zero, the green line, that would be pretty amazing. And we're going to get there by 2030, or we've written a plan for how to do that. And then all the carbon becomes the embodied carbon when you're looking at emissions from these new buildings. So the questions we asked in our embodied carbon inventory were really questions designed to inform our work. So things like how, this graph is nice, but how much carbon in any given year is from embodied carbon versus from operational carbon? Where should our work be focused? And when we're talking about new buildings and code updates, for any new building, what portion of the sort of lifetime emissions, right? You're sort of baking in emissions when you build a building. What portion of the lifetime emissions are embodied carbon versus that operational carbon? So that's some of the slides I'll show you. This is what we found in our first inventory of embodied carbon. So looking over time, if you look at annual embodied carbon, so that embodied carbon emissions in any one given year from buildings compared to all annual operational emissions over time, the embodied carbon has been pretty constant. It is significant. Denver grows by about 2% every year, right? That's how we're getting to 40% of our building stocks new by 2050. But if you look at 2019, that's our latest greenhouse gas inventory. We've got a little less than 6 million metric tons of carbon dioxide from total, and only a little less than 500,000 of that is embodied carbon. So this made me feel like relatively good that most of our work to date has focused on those operational emissions. Embodied carbon is smaller, right? But as we go forward, you can see our goals here, which is that by 2024, new homes are all electric. By 2027, new buildings are all electric. By 2030, all of our electricity is 100% renewable. So those operational emissions start going down. We have a goal that all buildings and homes, not just the new ones, by 2040, all of them are net zero energy. So this chart shows all electric, but they're going to be more efficient. They're going to be powered by 100% renewable electricity. They'll be all electric. And so by 2040, if we hit that goal, well, all of our emissions are the embodied carbon, right? That's what's left for buildings emissions. And so we've got to start thinking about how to get that carbon out as well, assuming we're successful in all these other really ambitious goals. Then their next thing that we looked at is that ratio sort of for buildings built in any given year, assuming that we implement our net zero implementation plan that we've laid out, what portion of the lifetime emissions for that building? And so I think it's actually lifetime embodied, but I will go double check because it says annual embodied, but I think it's lifetime embodied emissions versus lifetime operational emissions for a building. The closer we get to a net zero energy building, and by 2030, we'll have net zero energy new buildings that operate as designed. And as a community as a whole, they're all electric, highly efficient, powered by 100% renewable electricity. Well, then for those buildings, embodied carbon becomes the biggest part of their lifetime emissions. It becomes the problem we really need to solve for. So this starts to kind of put things in scale in terms of where our effort should be and what the opportunity is if we started to tackle embodied carbon. So next, the embodied carbon inventory looked at what is the embodied carbon by building type. So you can see a bunch of the different commercial building types and the emissions over in the green area showing carbon dioxide per meter squared or per foot. We'll stick with the green one. And it's interesting because we can see residential, just sort of at a quick glance, is clearly a lot less carbon intensive. There's less embodied carbon. These are all the big building types getting built the most in Denver right now. In particular, there's a lot of multifamily getting built in Denver. And then there's some office and single family. So again, where should we be focusing? This starts to tell us something about that, with which building types are the most carbon intensive. We looked at what are some of those hot spots, so what are the sources of embodied carbon? And again, this group may know this a lot better than us if you're looking at this really closely, but the typical hotspots are into the structure, beams and columns and floors and roofs, and the finishes, and then in the envelope, things like the panels and glass and insulation. So we started to look a little bit about like what is the opportunity here to reduce embodied carbon for some of these different materials. There's a what's the standard embodied carbon estimate for different materials? What's the low carbon estimate? And how much does that save if you moved to low carbon options on some of these materials? And it adds up to be pretty significant, right? We're finding that you can get something like a 60% reduction in embodied carbon by moving to lower carbon materials. What we haven't studied yet is like how readily available are those materials? How much do they cost, right? This is our first brush at like, okay, like I think there's something here, is what I take away from this, right? There's something here that we should start looking at more closely because it's going to become a bigger part of our emissions portfolio as we move all the new and all the existing buildings towards net zero energy in their operations. And so with that, I can take any questions. We can pause and see if there's just questions on our inventory. We could also just move right to Amber's presentation around like what's happening with our code update in the year ahead. How are we going to move towards that goal of net zero energy operations? And in code with one step, this next code update this year, how could you get involved in that? But happy just to take questions on this first.
I think there were several questions in the chat while you were presenting, but in order to make sure we have enough time for Amber, let's let her talk first, and then we'll field questions afterwards. Does that sound all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds great.
I think now, since you are host, you have to make Amber the host, because I cannot.
Right. You're the host, Amber.
Great. I will share my screen. Mine's pretty quick. And so let me. All right, which of course mine's not at the beginning either, so, okay. So I just wanted to go a little bit over our net zero plan and the code process, because it does actually really fit together. Hold on, let me admit somebody, it sounds like, okay. So I did want to just put this slide up. We often talk about 2020 and just all that we're trying to think about as far as equity and sustainability and environment and how they kind of all come together. So I just wanted to at least acknowledge that we are trying to think about the supports needed in addition to what we're working on. So Katrina mentioned our climate goals. We have an 80 by 50 climate action plan. We also have task force recommendations from our climate action task force last year. And then we just recently released our net zero new buildings and homes implementation plan, which goes into 4 foundations of net zero of highly energy efficient, all electric, renewable energy, and grid flexibility. And just for some guiding principles on that, so you all know, we're looking to achieve net zero as a whole community and different solutions based on building types with stakeholder help. So how does that fit into code adoption? So the plan outlines targets and milestones, but also allows for other opportunities of how things ultimately could fit into Denver's building and fire code. So we are starting our 2021 code adoption process, which is the first step of our net zero energy implementation plan, but also the opportunity to think through what other things should be considered, not only for our base building code, which is going to be the 2021 Denver building and fire code and is going to be based on the 2021 I codes, but also the 2021 Denver green code, which is our stretch code. And so right now that includes net zero energy and an all electric option, and includes a variety of topics. It's based on the IGCC, so those familiar with code kind of know the scope of that. But we're also going to be asking what things we should be considering. So, should we be considering embodied carbon or other metrics or other things that we kind of want to try out as part of a voluntary stretch code? The first step as we get into the 2021 code is actually preliminary meetings. We are going to have an initial meeting on both energy efficiency and sustainability. So the sustainability meeting will speak to and determine what topics we want to include in the Denver Green Code. And we'll also review proposed code amendments, initial ones, obviously, that we potentially might go into the actual code adoption process. So just so you can kind of see, this is the actual code adoption process. This is a typical I-code adoption process that goes all the way from developed city proposed amendments to approval. And that's pretty standard. And then I just also wanted to include the Denver Green Code process, which is more of a consensus committee process. And so those familiar with ANSI, it's not officially an ANSI process, but we will follow kind of a general, that general process where we're developing proposed code amendments and getting feedback. But there is definite opportunity, particularly with the Denver Green Code, to think through what should be included as part of future building codes in Denver. And that's all I had. I could get more into the net zero energy implementation plan, but I didn't want to necessarily take up time on operations since the goal of this group was embodied carbon. So.
Great, thank you. Thank you both, Amber and Katrina. That's great information. And so I guess at this point, we will transition into our Q&A and discussion period. Before we do that, I would like to ask everyone to turn on their cameras if you're able to, just because this will be a little bit more interactive, and to put the faces to the names, and we'll likely be interacting future in person, hopefully. So yeah, let's make it happen. All right, so I'm going to start out with some questions that came over chat, and then we can get a good discussion going as well. So someone asked, Jamie asked, are these figures based on construction starts and averages for construction types? I think that was.
Hi, Jamie. I saw a few questions in the chat about sort of how the numbers were calculated, how we estimated building types. So maybe I can just kind of give an overview on the methodology. So it's helpful to know that is of interest. We had a consultant that completed this for us, Lotus Engineering. So if we get into questions beyond kind of what I give you here, I can always follow up. But basically they identified all of the existing and forecasted new square footage. We have a forecast from a Dodge data set predicting growth in Denver by building type and homes between 2020 and 2023 that we figured is kind of more accurate than just in a flat kind of growth assumption. Then our standard growth assumption is that we predict Denver will grow by 1.5% every year. So we just forecasted forward at a 1.5% growth rate from 2020 or 2023 through the end of whatever analysis you had seen. That's how we got to like our 40% growth by 2050. It's just assuming a 1.5% growth rate. I think that's actually a conservative number. We arrived at that 1.5% growth rate number with our chief economist a couple of years ago. But if you look back at the last 20 years, we've grown on average more like 2% a year. But at the time, at least, our chief economist wasn't sure we'd keep growing quite that fast. So we use a 1.5% growth rate. And we have a forecast in that early years, the 2020 to 2023, about which building types will grow the most. We have a forecast by building type from Dodge. After 2023, we don't really have an accurate forecast around which building types will grow the most. We just assumed even growth across all building types. So the data sort of over that longer term is just based on that assumption. We retrieved the embodied carbon emission factors using the Carbon Leadership Forum's embodied carbon benchmark research, and then aligned that with Denver's building types, and then calculated that annual and lifetime embodied carbon emissions for each building type and added all of that up. I think that starts to get at a bunch of your questions. I think that's related to some of the other questions in the chat also. I think I might have also seen one on what was the source of emission factors that's related to that methodology question. Are you asking about emission factors for electricity specifically, or?
I think that is Dylan's question. If you don't mind to unmute yourself, Dylan.
Oh, no, I was just wondering because there wasn't any source cited in the presentation, just where that information was coming from. But Katrina, you did a pretty good job of explaining it. So you answered my question.
Awesome. And we'll have this report will be out publicly soon. It has the charts that I've showed. It just doesn't have the whole narrative. We're still editing the narrative. So that will all be in the methodology when we publish our embodied carbon inventory in the next month or two.
Great. So yeah, I think that covered a couple of questions. The next question was from Victoria. When will the green code meetings start? When
Yeah,
can
sure.
we get involved?
So if you email me, and I can put my email in the chat, I'm keeping a list of people to reach out to for the preliminary green code and energy code meetings. They'll probably start early second quarter, and we'll be publicizing those quite extensively through our newsletters, both our newsletter at the climate office, and the CPD as well. So we're hoping to get wide interest and have as many participants as are interested in being there. So give me a second and I will put my email in the chat. So
Great, thank you. Just making a note there. All right. Linda, do you just want to go ahead and ask your question instead of me reading the question out? Maybe I'll do that going forward. I noticed there's several more questions in the chat, and instead of me reading it, it's just quicker if you guys ask directly.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation and the information. And my question was about some of the work on carbon sequestration is bigger than one project, or that one project can afford. And so I'm curious about how the city has considered or would consider seed money that helps to invest in something that all of all projects in the area can take advantage of.
I don't know that it's something that we have considered before. So feel free to send us ideas though. I'll also just, while I'm speaking, I'll put in the chat the link to sign up for our newsletter. So if you sign up for our new buildings newsletter in particular, you will get the embodied carbon inventory when it comes out. You will get all the notices about our code process and how to get involved. So you can get on Amber's list if you want to be really involved. If you just kind of want to track this, fill out this little form and click new buildings and homes, and you will get everything.
Thank you. Patrick, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jim. So my question was about how we're going to transition to an all-electric system. So in particular, with the relatively cheap cost of natural gas, how would we both fund the startup costs of acquiring that all-electric heating equipment, and then going forward with higher operational costs of that electricity compared to the natural gas? Would there be funds available, for example, for businesses and homeowners to make those transitions themselves? Or how would we make that change given the cost comparison?
Yeah, so for new buildings, the studies we're seeing, and we are doing our own right now, are that it's actually cheaper to build an all-electric new building or an all-electric new home, because you avoid all the natural gas infrastructure costs. And heat pumps both heat and cool, so you could just put in a heat pump instead of having to put in both a furnace or a boiler and a cooling system. So that's what the initial numbers are showing for upfront cost. And again, for new buildings, we're seeing the studies show that the operating cost should also be cheaper for an all-electric building or home that has an air source heat pump. And it's because heat pumps are so much more efficient than a natural gas heating system. So electricity is more expensive than gas, but heat pumps are 200% plus 250% efficient. So as we move to heat pumps, you should see that studies are showing like 2 to 10%, depending on if it's a home or a building, cheaper energy bills over time.
Mm-hmm. What about for existing buildings though? Like, for facilities that already have a gas burning furnace, how would they afford to switch out to a heat pump? And then also with a heat pump, like that's my understanding too, that in an ideal world, we could install a lot more of those. They are very efficient, but with our colder winters too, my understanding is that oftentimes you need an auxiliary heat system for when you drop maybe below 20 degrees or so, that heat pump is no longer particularly efficient, and you either need a dual system to burn gas still, or then you're paying potentially much, 2 to 3 higher times in costs to use that electric heat backup system.
Yeah, we are still, so we're doing a strategic existing building electrification implementation plan right now. We're getting all the results from an analysis of the cost of converting a whole bunch of different heating typologies, because when you get to existing buildings, there's a lot of different ways they're heated. They have different heating, HVAC systems, they have different water heating systems, they have different cooling systems, and of course heat pumps can replace both. And so how do you convert the whole building? It is more challenging from a cost perspective, but there's often ways where you can get most of the way there, and maybe you keep a little bit of gas backup. It depends on the building type in terms of making it cost effective, but so we'll have more soon. So sign up for that existing building list in the link I put in the chat if you want all the updates on that existing building electrification implementation plan as we come out with it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, is it okay if I jump in here for a sec? As a person who just recently went ahead and got rid of my gas furnace and put in kind of state-of-the-art Mitsubishi heat pump here in Boulder, no problem getting through this super cold spell that we just had. Have enough solar to cover the costs, and so I think it's more difficult with a retrofit than existing build or new builds for sure, but definitely possible, and probably required that we kind of start thinking that way.
That's right. Thanks, Victor. And we do have, I didn't talk a lot about it, but we do have our Energize Denver task force that is writing a building performance policy right now to take all of our existing buildings to net zero energy by 2040. They're just have met twice. They'll meet through September. So they're just getting into the meat of that conversation around how we go about requiring this transition in existing buildings. They won't be working on homes because it's a different sort of policy question. So that will just be existing commercial and multifamily buildings, but it is doable. We're finding we have a conversion pathway for every building type, but there may be some things that we try to do to avoid things like panel upgrades and high bills from electric resistance heat and things like that in the plan.
Great. Thanks for sharing, Victor. That's good information, Katrina. Let's see, Mr. Bacchus, do you want to go next? Yeah, I think you have a couple of questions on there.
And not, sorry for interrupting before Jamie goes, not to stop the energy conversation. I love energy conversations too, but we are kind of like going towards another field. So Jamie, if there is anybody that is if you have a specific questions towards embodied carbon related, please go ahead. Otherwise, we can keep going to other people that might be interested on this topic too. Thank you.
I think myself and the person below me both have questions about kind of thoughts on time frame when we might start introducing embodied carbon of materials into code cycles. And I think I don't want to totally summarize the next question, but look like Jamie was asking about, are there any existing codes in other states that have already tried to tackle this? I'm very curious about like what sort of language we might use for trying to tackle embodied carbon of materials in buildings, because it's got to vary quite a bit by building type, and how do you set up a baseline and metrics, and how do you hold buildings accountable for that? So just curious on what the thought is for starting to incorporate embodied carbon of materials into codes, and how soon that might be coming.
Yeah, so we're just starting to think about it. I will mention that in our 2018 or 2019 code cycle, we did dip our toe in the water by allowing 15-story timber buildings in the base code. And under the Denver Green Code, one of the requirements is around construction waste to meet the current voluntary Denver Green Code. And so that's kind of all that we've done so far. I think there's a lot of folks starting to think about this, and not that many models out there, but I might actually toss it to Victor again, because I think he's starting to think about what else is out there. I don't know if you have answers on who else has models on embodied carbon in codes, but it is new.
Sure. Well, it is new, I think, everywhere. I think many places are adopting policies rather than codes. And Marin County has probably got the best kind of concrete and cement code out there at the moment. But all of them are, within the last few years that have hit the streets. And now at the federal level, it's worth noting that the GSA has recently adopted a advice letter looking at a policy to consider low embodied carbon materials, both at a material level and also at a whole building LCA level moving forward. So I think it's got a lot of momentum behind it, and I think adopting them at a policy level where appropriate and at a code level as code cycles come up is a very powerful way of moving both demand for low embodied products forward, as well as increasing the amount of people that are providing those products. So it's exciting. It's a great time to kind of be active in this field.
I also think it's worth looking at like green building policies from universities or corporations. Mm-hmm. So we're working with a few universities right now to set their green building guidelines, and which includes an embodied carbon goal or like a minimum level. And similarly with corporations, so the groups who want to push the envelope before code is changing are starting to include language around embodied carbon in their design guidelines. And the problem, I think, is, so we're working with a project on Penn State University, and the design team, as well as some of the manufacturers, are really interested in doing an embodied carbon analysis, specifically because the project chose to save a large building instead of demo and rebuild. So there's a really exciting embodied carbon story to tell, but none of us have scope to do that kind of analysis. And so we basically all agreed to do it for free. And we split up, like spliced up little pieces of which company's doing what, to basically be able to share this case study and share this story, but we didn't get paid for it. And so I think that that's been a challenge, at least that we've seen, is we're interested in it. A few of our design partners are interested in it, but to convince an owner to pay extra to do something like that before they're required to has been a little bit of a challenge.
That's helpful. Please send us, I'll put my email in the chat also, but please send us examples like that you can think of. Like I would toss it out to this whole group for ideas because you all are thinking about this or helping clients do this on occasion. And like, what could those standards be? How do you go about writing that into something like code? What's easy to just get started with, right? Because we're going to start with the things that are easy, but some of these products may be readily available and easy, and where are their models out there? Because
and requiring something like EPDs, like saying like at least 10 materials you use have to have an EPD, and then forcing someone to collect those EPDs and submit them to get approval is a good first step. And so you're not saying you have to measure to a certain point or you have to get a certain amount of embodied carbon or whatever. There's no benchmark there, but it's like the more we start asking, especially from the owners, the more they are asking, like, I need an EPD from this concrete manufacturer or this drywall or like all these building materials, the more that demand will shift. And we've seen that in our industry through like furniture and carpet, but there's still a lot of laggards. And so I think that like almost having a tiered approach of like, let's just require, 50 EPDs per project or a certain percentage based on material type or whatever that is. And then the next step would be like, okay, now let's benchmark it and reduce it, because it's not all going to happen overnight.
And I can jump in a little bit because I work Seattle, Portland, and Denver combined, and Seattle has a few opportunities where you can change the floor area ratio, getting an increase there. They've actually allowed an extra story on one building over the prescriptive code. So there's unique things like that we can do as policy. But I think to Julie's point, the hardest part has been developing what's the baseline. So how to take it, how do you say you're reducing it? And so we've had to take the building designed as steel and the building designed as timber to a certain level to finally prove the situation that the timber was better, and then drop off and then just keep designing the building with timber. So that's how we approached it. But I think there's easy non-cost things to do. Like changing floor area ratio that's not really costing the city anything for the most part. So to incentivize reduce embodied carbon.
And thank you, Ethan. I wanted to add to that for the city of Denver, like there's so many different policies, so many different approaches to embodied carbon, like set up a maximum per square feet, set up a threshold comparing to a baseline. But as Victor and Matt had participated, I think maybe some, or they're familiar at least with the Marin County in California that they did for concrete procurement. So a policy that it was based on concrete. We all know that cement is a huge impact. So there are like different approaches, and I think the best way to look into the cities itself is what the city can really control or can do. So including concrete suppliers and requesting EPDs and playing with that at least. So I think the most interesting reductions might come for things that can be accountable for the area, and then look into other further reductions with building comparisons and the baseline and EPDs and other things. But it's really exciting, and thank you for the presentation again. That it is very exciting that you all are thinking on this topic.
Yeah, I was going to hop in with another question. So I was wondering, Katrina and Amber, if there's any intent, it seems like this report is really focused on the population of buildings across Denver. Is there any intent to also implement, low embodied carbon procurement policies for public projects? One example we see a lot, especially in the federal government, is start with public projects, and that's a mechanism to pushing things out to all projects. So is that, part of the approach side by side with pushing things out to the public, or something you haven't gotten into yet?
The city always tries to lead by example and stay a step ahead of what we're requiring of the private sector. We're just starting to have some of these conversations as we go into revising the executive order that kind of governs sustainability across a lot of our public projects. So nothing definite yet, but we're starting to think about that too.
Great.
Katrina and Amber, is there anything else that you already mentioned that this group could provide feedback on to help guide Denver's policies going forward? Any particular insights that you'd be interested to hear?
I don't think so. I would just say, do feel free to send us ideas on how to go about addressing some of this. Get involved when we get into the code process. You can submit a code proposal, and then our code consultant can help with refining that and sort of getting it into proper code language. So even if you weren't certain on how to put some of this in code language, feel free to go ahead and submit something like a code amendment.
Okay, someone was excited about that.
Apologies for the screaming children.
Understand. I'm
Some
sure
kids
a lot
just
of us have
don't
been
like
there.
code language.
All right. Any other questions? We are about 5 minutes to the top of the hour. So any last questions?
I was going to jump in. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Victoria, I know you want me to stay on embodied carbon, so I'll do my best to connect this. But Amber, it's great to see you at the city. Nice to see you. I saw in the embodied carbon thing, Katrina, that rigid insulation has a lot of embodied carbon, and then there are alternatives. But it's great that Amber's with you in the group, because we do have to balance what we do with embodied carbon with the energy penalty we might pay if we are going to something that has less insulative value or is more costly. To meet the energy codes, we need to have the rigid insulation. And if we go to things to extremes, like at least on the residential side for passive house or something, we've got even more rigid insulation potentially. But balancing the alternatives with the costs and with the energy penalty will be important as well.
Great point. And I really liked the comment by Michael Darrow in the chat also, that the embodied carbon will decrease as the grid gets greener across the country. And so, you know, where the emissions come from the electric sector. I think that's interesting to factor in also.
Great. Yeah, I really look forward to seeing the report once it's published. It looks really interesting and looks like you have a good data set to work with. So that's exciting.
Is there sorry, Jim, is there a timeline, Katrina or Amber, when the report is going to be out? Is it going to be in the next few weeks, a month, or?
I think in the next month or two. It just needs a good edit, but we'll see when we find the time, and we have to run it through a few approvals and set up the timing and getting it out. So month or two, and the report should be out.
Great. Well, let me share my screen real quick. I just want to thank
Jim,
Katrina and Amber again. Yeah, go ahead, Victoria.
sorry, just to respond to Dawn as well. There is a very good, if you look on YouTube, CLF Vancouver, and you will find an insulation webinar that was presented, and there is a lot of information with their R values and the related embodied carbon emissions. So you might find that very helpful.
Great tip. Thank you. Thanks again, Amber and Katrina, for taking the time out to share with us today. It was really interesting, and I think, you know, a lot of us look forward to engaging in the Green Code process. Just as a reminder to everyone, please do sign up for the mailing list. You'll be able to click this link in the slides once they're sent out, and then you can always email Victoria, Matt, and I at the CLF Rocky Mountain Hub at gmail.com email address, or get a hold of us through the CLF community. And with that, I think we are all set. So thanks all for joining and spending your time, and we'll talk to you at the next meeting. Take care.